Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I do have Miss Alina Lyons helping me to moderate the chat. So I'm just curious if we could just start off by people letting me know if they can hear me. And Alina, please let me know because I don't think I can see the chat. So let me know if people are responding that they can hear me.
Yes, people can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to get started now. I want to start off by thanking Mr. Howe, who's the principal at Lambton Kingsway, for setting this up. The original plan was that I think he was going to sort of introduce me, but in my setting up of the webinar, I can't get his mic to work right now. So I do apologize to Mr. Howe for not letting not setting it up appropriately. So I'm just going to get started, and I just want to start off by thanking you all for signing in on a Tuesday evening. I know that we're all very busy, and so I appreciate it greatly that you've taken the time to sign in on our talk today on empowering young minds, strategies for building resilience and managing anxiety. My name is Ed Roldan. I will be introducing myself a bit more formally in a little bit. So just to begin, I want to mention just a friendly reminder. You'll notice as you sign in that camera and microphones will remain off. I want you to feel free to type in questions into the chat box. Like I mentioned, Ms. Alina Lyons is very kind enough to be helping me today to manage the chat. And so at certain points, I might ask her if there are any questions. And I will also, I will make myself available at the end. If people have questions, I'll stay and answer any questions that come up. Yeah, so please type in your questions into the chat. Let's review a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to start off, the talk is supposed to be on resilience, but before I get to resilience, I want to sort of set the table a little bit. And so I'm going to start by extending an invitation to you all to look at anxiety from perhaps a slightly different way than we normally do. We're then going to transition into talking about one program, an evidence-based program called SPACE, about empowering parents. And then we're going to transition into resilience and talk about what it is and how we as parents can promote it, including practical steps that we can take to help our children to develop more resilience by small, incremental, meaningful change. One thing you're going to hear from me repeatedly is I'm going to emphasize this idea of practical, small steps that we can do on a regular basis to promote things like resilience in our children. I'm going to end off by talking about some things you might want to consider that might change how you respond to certain things, depending on the child of your child's age. Okay, so it's going to vary a little bit as to how we do some of these, how we instill resilience in a grade 3 child versus a grade 8 child. So I will be trying to discuss that in some detail as well. So who am I? So my name is Dr. Ed Roldan. I'm a director of Child and Adolescent Services at Etobicoke Psychological Services. In Vaughan, our name is EPS Family Health. We have a location on Highway 7. We've been around for 7 years in Etobicoke. The co-directors are myself and my sister, and I oversee the child and adolescent side and assessment side of the clinic. And I am a clinical and school psychologist, and I work with children of all ages, adolescents, and also adults, with a particular interest in working with parents. And I worked for 10 years in the school system. The last 4 years, I've transitioned into full-time private practice work, although I do consult at the George Health Center as well. One of my other passions is supervision. And so I have a large team of people who are early career psychologists, and I supervise them at the clinic. So a couple of disclaimers at the start of our conversation. I just want to point out that I am not providing psychological services. What that means is I will not be discussing any individual cases or situations. My aim is to provide you with information and resources, as well as perhaps a slightly different way of approaching your relationship with your children. And I will say, and you'll hear me say this, I'm a parent. I'm a parent of 2 boys. And something I'll say again repeatedly is I'm an anxious parent. So I think that's always interesting, as here I am talking about anxiety, and I'm an anxious dad. And so we will talk about that later. The focus of today's conversation is all of us in the room, the parents. It is not necessarily the children directly. It is what we can do as parents. And what I'm hoping to do through this conversation is to cultivate a sense of awareness. in a sense of 1 degree change, which I'll review momentarily. One thing I want to point out is embedded within today's conversation are a variety of topics that can have their own presentations. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail, but we'll touch upon mindful parenting, emotion coaching, self-regulation. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things that can have their own presentation. So I'm curious, I imagine that some of you have heard of this 1 degree change. If not, let me set it up for you. Imagine that you're a passenger on a massive cruise ship, one of these new massive cruise ships. Imagine that you're on the ship and the captain decides to change the trajectory of the cruise ship by 1 degree. Given such a slight change, you as a passenger wouldn't feel it. That 1 degree change would be, you wouldn't notice it. Now, if you take the trajectory of the cruise ship along its original path, and compare it to where it ends up based on 1 degree change over a long distance, you'll notice that the ship ends up at a vastly different part of the ocean. That concept is crucial to the work that I'm going to be discussing today. I'm asking you to consider what is 1 degree change that might seem inconsequential right now, that may lead to meaningful change and improvement in terms of your relationship with your children and how your children are coping or handling stresses that come their way. I mentioned that I was going to propose a slightly different way at looking at anxiety. So here goes. And I'm providing a trigger warning. And what I mean by that is if you have any sort of phobia or fear of spiders, you may want to look away for the next slide. And so here is my proposal about looking at anxiety from a slightly different perspective. So here goes. Imagine that all of us were in the same room. And imagine that somebody, I don't know why, dropped in hundreds of tarantulas into the same room as us. I'm curious if you could type into the chat and let me know how you might respond to tarantulas in the same room. Now, a couple things. You can't kill the tarantulas, and let's assume that you don't like tarantulas. I'm curious, how would you respond to being in the same room as a tarantula? And Alina, maybe you can let me know some of the responses.
Yeah, so we've got scream and run.
Mm-hmm. Any others? Anybody else?
I would probably freak out, create a barrier.
Perfect.
Ignore it, pretend it's not there, run for the closest door.
Perfect. Thank you, Alina. Thank you so much. So I'll tell you 2 things that will happen when the tarantulas are in the same room. The first thing that's going to happen is that our attention and focus is going to be solely on the tarantulas. We're constantly going to be scanning and looking to see where the tarantulas are. Secondly, our behavioral repertoire is going to shrink to tracking the tarantulas and avoiding the tarantulas and looking for an exit. So we're going to forget why we were in the room in the first place. And we're only going to be looking at where's the tarantula, where can I go, how do I get away from it? In this example, the tarantula is much like anxiety. When anxiety comes into our lives or our children's lives, it takes all of our attention and focus, and it starts to control our choices and the things that we're willing to engage in. I have good news and bad news, however. The bad news is I don't know how to get rid of people's tarantulas. And the reason is this. If I get you to take a moment and just list in your mind things that you value, things that are important to you, things that mean something to you, like your children, your spouse, your partner, your career, your reputation, extended family. Think about anything that you value, and your brain is wired to every so often throw little warnings at you about those things. For example, for me, in any given day, my brain might say, "You sure your boys are safe? You sure your wife got to work?" And so, if you're living a life of meaning, there will be moments of anxiety. And so I cannot get rid of tarantulas for you. Now, the good news is that what I want to do through my work is to teach people that if we're all in the same room and tarantulas were to be dropped into that same room, we would teach, and this is what I do with clients, is we would look at the tarantula, We would notice how uncomfortable the tarantulas make us feel, and then we would engage in meaningful action within the same room as the tarantula. So what is it that I want to be doing in this room? Even though the tarantula is there, we're not ignoring it, but we're shifting towards small, meaningful actions that lead us closer to meaning. And so I want you to keep that in mind, because when we get calls at the clinic about, can you help my child and cure their anxiety, or can you help them, get rid of this thing that they're anxious about? That is not my emphasis. And I think that this is one of the crucial things that I want you to consider when we talk about resilience building in our children. So seed number one. My first sort of recommendation is that we emphasize solving and getting rid of anxiety less, and we promote things like behavioral changes towards engagement, so doing things that bring us meaning. And so notice that I talked about moving towards things. One of the things that comes up in our work is that often, or that our main motivation for things or choices is avoidance of discomfort. So I'd rather not feel this. I'd rather not do this. And so we end up putting a lot of walls around ourselves. And so in this example of a tarantula, what I want to work on is noticing the tarantula, noticing how uncomfortable it makes us, and then moving towards something that is important or meaningful to us. All right, so I'm going to show you a video now. It's about 2.5 minutes. What I'd like for you, and I'm gonna ask you to put some responses in the chat, is just notice your reaction to the video. Now, when I tested this earlier, the sound was kind of low, so I do apologize about that. Hopefully you guys can hear it. If not, I'll provide a very quick sort of overview of the video. So all I'm asking is notice your reaction to this video.
There's no sound again. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Apologize. Let me stop that. So I apologize. Give me a sec. Let me see if I can get this. And we'll go here. Give me a sec. If you ever want to see a psychologist stress, this is always a good opportunity. So let's go here. Let's see if I could. All right, so here goes. I'm going to play that video again, and I'm hoping that the sound works this time, okay? So here goes.
Yep, we're good.
I hear you too, Mama. You're right there.
Yes, I am.
Why are you crying, Mama?
Because I'm happy.
Okay. All right, give me a sec. So my understanding is that the video might have been a bit choppy, so I do apologize about that. So let me recap it. So basically the video is a clip from the movie Ray, and it is a scene where when he's a young boy, he falls on the floor and immediately calls for his mom. He's yelling, "Mama, Mama." And as he's yelling, she looks to want to step in and then decides to take a step back. And then he then proceeds to start to take in all of the sounds around him to try to understand what's going on around him. And he starts to explore the room, and he almost walks to the fire, and he eventually feels the heat and he stops himself. At the end, he sort of says, "Mom, why are you crying?" And she says, "Because I'm happy." And so it's just an interesting video. So I'm curious if you could share in the thoughts what came up for you. And Alina, maybe you could tell me some of the reactions.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got son was safe and in no danger. Mom acknowledged, looked, and remained calm for him to try to work through things. Son appears blind but tunes into his other senses. And then another person has said she wants him to try. Someone else picked up that it is about Ray Charles. Mom is teaching him to be independent. And then it's stressful at the beginning. Then he saw his auditory abilities were strong, so it was reassuring at the end. Hard to watch, tough moment as a parent, or sorry, tough moment for a parent.
Yeah.
Hard to stand by and let one fumble, risk, and then figure it out for himself.
Amazing. Thank you, Alina. Thank you so much for the comments. It's interesting. I do presentations quite often, and the most common response I get to that video is the one that I have, which is like, "No way, I'm jumping in." Remember, I told you I'm an anxious dad, so I'm like, there's no way I could sit back and do that. But let's keep that in mind as we go to the next part of the presentation. And this is where we transition to lessons from SPACE. So what is SPACE? So SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And this is a program developed by Ellie Leibowitz at Yale University. And what they have done is they have shown in the last 10 to 15 years that you can improve clinically significant anxiety and OCD in children and youth by focusing on parents alone. You do no work with the children themselves. You only work with parents. And so let's talk a little bit about SPACE. Now, again, I could do a whole conversation on SPACE. I'm going to go really quickly today. One of the first things that SPACE does is to try to teach parents how to validate the experiences of their children. So in order, like, for example, saying something like, "I can understand that you don't want to go to soccer practice today. Because it's really anxiety provoking, and because all the other kids are really good, and because you think that you can't keep up with them." And so in some ways I'm validating by saying, "I get it. I get why you're anxious and nervous." And the second part that SPACE does is try to teach parents to instill a sense of confidence. And I know you can do it because you went last week and you went the week before. And so the first step of SPACE is teaching parents to validate the emotion while instilling some confidence. The second part of SPACE is to teach parents how to notice accommodations that we all do to try to prevent our children from experiencing distress or discomfort. You know, I started off today by telling you that I'm an anxious dad. And part of the reason I say that to you is because sometimes when we talk about SPACE, people can sometimes feel like they're being judged. And I can tell you that when I work with families and parents, there is no judgment, okay? Because I will do a lot of these things myself. And I often, I joke about this with my clients all the time. I often have to think about, like, what would I say to a client here? Because as a parent, I know what I want to do. And sometimes I can be driven by my anxiety. And so I need to say, well, take a step back. What would you say to a client here? And so accommodations are defined as anything extra you do to help your child avoid discomfort or uncertainty. And one of the interesting things is, as we accommodate, what we do is we're inadvertently interfering with our child's ability to develop a sense of resilience, to be able to know that they can handle what they were worried about. And even if the worst case scenario occurs, they have either the support or the capacity to bounce back. And so I'm wondering, as we go through this, some of this might resonate with some of you more than others, okay? So what are some examples of accommodations? Some examples include things like answering reassurance questions over and over. Are you sure? Mom, what time? Mom, what time? Mom, what time? Dad, what time are you going? Are you going to be there? Are you going to be there? Are you going to be there? Dad, are you going to do that? Think about that. Reassurance questions, answering over and over and over. And perhaps you're somebody who takes your child to the doctor repeatedly. They say to you, no, Dad, this is something, this pain is different. This time there's something going on here. You got to take me to the doctor. And then you find yourself going to the doctor repeatedly. Or maybe you help your child avoid anxiety producing scenarios. Things like maybe you're sleeping in the same room as them. Maybe you're allowing them to stay home from a class trip or from school, or maybe you're calling the school all the time to try to jump in for them when something's happening with a teacher or with peers. Okay, so I want you to think about the extra accommodations are extra things you do to prevent your child from experiencing distress. Sometimes families can engage in modifications. So modifications is when you change routine or avoid certain things because your child can't handle it. So, for example, you might take on responsibility. So, examples would be somebody who decides to start coaching soccer because that's the only way their child is going to participate. Or maybe you find yourself rearranging your work schedule to make sure that you're home at a certain time. Or maybe you have an overly rigid schedule where one of the best if you have overly rigid schedules, it kind of does away with the unknown, right? That Monday's this, Tuesday's this, Wednesday's this. So sometimes having too much schedule or things scheduled to such a high degree can be for anxiety reasons. We don't want our child to be anxious if there's an unknown. And then lastly, and you'll see this in the clinic all the time, is when we as families start to hide triggering objects, or we avoid talking about certain things or going to certain restaurants. So for example, at our clinic, we've had many clients who can't say the word vomit. Right? They avoid saying the word vomit. They will use other ways of saying that word, or they'll just say like the word, or they'll find a different way to say it because a child might say, no, you're not allowed to say that, or else I'm going to vomit. Okay, so those are examples of modifications. I imagine maybe for some of you, as you're listening to this, you're like, oh man, do we accommodate? Well, let me guide you a little bit in recognizing whether something's an accommodation or not. The first one is a crucial one. Is it developmentally appropriate? So for example, if you have a child in kindergarten and you find that there are nights when you have to get into the bed with them, I'm not so worried. Now, if your child's in grade 8 and you have to get into bed with them, now it's no longer developmentally appropriate. Second thing I want you to think about, and this goes back to mindful parenting, which again, I'm only going to touch upon today, but what is your motivation for doing a behavior? Ask yourself, why did I step in? I just gave you an example of me where I often find myself, if I really pay attention, some of my choices are based on me being anxious. Okay. Ask yourself, would you be doing this action or behavior if your child wasn't anxious? Do you do it for their sibling? Okay. Or what happens if you don't do the behavior? So if I don't answer the question over and over and over again, what happens? If it's anxiety related, you're going to see a spike in meltdown. Like you're going to see a temper tantrum perhaps. Okay, so this is how you start to ask yourself whether you're engaging in accommodations, which we all do, by the way. So it's not about getting rid of them completely. It's about noticing the impact of accommodations. So seed number 2, let's say this is resonating with you and you're saying, you know what, we do this quite a bit. Part of the reason I'm sharing this information about the SPACE program is to help you feel empowered that there are things you can do as a family to help improve the situation for your child. And so if you were to go and decide to start doing the SPACE program, which by the way, at the end of today's conversation, I'm going to give you the name of a book by Ellie Leibovitz, the creator, which I should I joke about this all the time. I have no shares in, because I basically tell every family that comes to talk to me to buy this book, but it will walk you through how you can do this in a systematic way as a family. And the first step that you do in space is to start charting accommodations. Start noticing how much you're accommodating in the morning, after school, on weekends. And then you can start to try to experiment by removing or altering an accommodation. And so if this is resonating with you and you're thinking like, how would I even know how to start? So the first step is mapping them all and charting them. The second step is to start to think about one that you want to remove. And once you get into the space program, the way you remove it is you actually communicate it to the child. And you say, John, mommy and daddy have been coming into the room every night, and we've decided that we've noticed that it's not helpful to you. And so we're confident that you can handle sleeping on your own. And so starting on Wednesday, we're no longer going to come into the bedroom. Now there's a whole other, there could be meltdowns, and we can talk about what you would do in that scenario. But when you're choosing what you want to target, you want to make sure it's a significant problem. You want to make sure that's a recurring and frequent problem. You don't want to choose something that only happens once a month. And lastly, you want to make sure that you're actually choosing an accommodation, that it is anxiety related. And so again, going back to why I'm including this here is that because before we get to resilience, I want to make sure that I emphasize to you that there are evidence-based approaches and findings that say that what we do as parents can help our children even with clinically significant problems. So imagine what we can do in our daily lives. So what is resilience? Resilience is basically the ability to adapt, bounce back, and thrive despite facing adversity, challenges, or stressful situations. It involves things like coping with stress, developing positive coping mechanisms that contribute to emotional well-being and overall growth. One thing that I want to emphasize is that resilience is not a fixed trait. What I mean by that is not something that you achieve. You're never going to get a certificate and say, I am resilient. It is something that you are constantly working towards. So it's a dynamic process that's influenced by a variety of factors, such as genetics, environment, and individual experiences. And so we're constantly, as parents, when I'm talking to you tonight, what I'm trying to emphasize is what are small little things that we can instill into our day-to-day experiences that help our children move towards resilience. Okay, and part of that is by fostering a supportive and nurturing environment, by teaching things like problem-solving skills, by promoting emotion regulation and encouraging positive social relationships. Again, each of that last paragraph can have its own presentation. But just quickly, one of the things that I want to emphasize is, and we'll talk about this later in terms of like the developmental stages, is that emotion regulation is going to look vastly different if you're dealing with a kindergarten child versus a grade 8 child. So in kindergarten, we're basically helping our child to develop resilience by teaching them how to label and notice. Oh, I can see you're sad because you're crying, and because I can see your body's all down. I'm sorry, buddy. I know you're sad, huh? Versus a grade 8, you might not be using that same language, right? You might be saying, yeah, you're sad. How, what do you need? Comfort? How can I help you? Right? There are different approaches that we're engaging in that really tap into things like emotion regulation. So what are some practical steps that we can do as parents? Well, one of the first things that I want to sort of mention today is this: supporting your children ride the waves of emotion and teach them to the available options during stressful times. So this goes back to what I just said. One of the very first things we want to be able to do is when our child is showing big emotions is to recognize that that is human, that is normal. What we want to teach our children is not that there are such things as bad emotions, is that emotions, all of them, are human and they make sense. And what we want to do is teach our children to be able to navigate whenever those emotions come up for them. Second thing we want to do is emphasize the importance of seeking help and leaning on a support network. One thing that I haven't said today, and this is crucial, is that how we behave is going to be more powerful than what we say. So how you handle or how you display resilience, how do you handle stressful scenarios? How do you handle things when things don't go well? How do you handle when something disappointing happens, right? That how you handle it is going to be more important than what you say. So something like seeking help, being able to show our children that there are times when I might say, I need to turn to somebody to help here, is something that's going to be really powerful in our ability to instill resilience in our children. And then the last one is, this is a big one. It's quite relevant in my family. Maybe it will be for you as well. Is this idea of the growth mindset? You know, so I have two boys. My oldest son, in many ways, is brilliant. Things come easy to him, and yet at the same time, whenever something doesn't come easy for him, oh, it's the end of the world. It's the worst thing. He can't do it. He'll never get it. You know, what's the point? It's useless. And a lot of what we do is try to instill this sense of, yeah, not yet. Yeah, you can't do that yet, right? It's about teaching that failure is part of growth. And so that is something that I would ask you to consider as parents, is to, is to think about consciously, mindfully, how do I send a message whenever my child is struggling that this is a process and that you're there to support them, really. Just checking the time. Okay, so as we move towards resilience, one of the things I want you, just to recap, I want and I suggest that we start to recognize that we cannot save our children from all difficult experiences and failures. So think back to when I talked about space. The second point on this slide is one of my favorite ones, and I just threw this in here because I think it's really powerful. And this is actually a recommendation that I make to parents, but I also make this to early career therapists. And this is, when your child is experiencing a big emotion or some disappointment, so often when we hear that, we want to provide solutions. We want to say something. We want to respond in some way. And yet I really want to emphasize that silence can be golden. If somebody is being vulnerable with you and they're displaying or sharing something painful and hurtful, I would prefer if you empathize, listen, and connect. So something like, oh, my God, that sounds so difficult. Thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine what that's like for you. I really appreciate you telling me that. And sitting with that can be more powerful than if I said, you know what, why don't you do this? Or why don't you do this? Or how about if we invalidate and say something like, oh, that's not a big deal. You should have seen what happened to me, right? And so if you find yourself having that tendency to do that, I would ask you to consider the next time this comes up, see if you can be silent. See if you can think to yourself, can I empathize, listen, and connect? And that might be just nodding and sort of like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. That sounds horrible. And that's it. That can be so powerful. And in essence, what you're doing is you're teaching your children to be able to bring up something that's uncomfortable without feeling like parents are only just going to give them solutions. And the reality is this: as kids get older, the solutions you provide, they know them for the most part. They'll be like, yeah, this is where they start to feel like I know what you're going to tell me. And they stop talking to parents, especially as they get older, because they know what the parents are going to say. And so if you can instill that sense of, you can share things with me and I'm going to sit here with you and try to connect with you in this moment of pain, I feel that this is going to be more helpful in building resilience in your children. In essence, what are we doing with that? We're trying to help our children to feel understood and heard. And one thing I want to emphasize is, me saying and connecting with my child doesn't mean I have to agree with what is happening. So for example, if my oldest son had thrown something at my youngest son, I would never be able to tell them, or I would never tell them that it's okay that they did that. But I might say something like, yeah, I get it. Your brother was annoying you and you were feeling pretty frustrated and you threw that block at him. I get it. I get why you were annoyed. And we don't throw blocks in this house. And here's the consequence. So when I'm talking to you about connecting with your children, it is not about free reign. It's not about not having consequences. It is about connecting with that moment of vulnerability, so telling them, I get it. As a human being, I get that experience. And yet at the same time, here are the consequences. And so in essence, what we're doing is we're modeling for them how, our belief in their ability to handle and bounce back from that difficult moment. And that's really one of the things we want to do, is emphasize a sense of confidence and a sense that they can handle things that come their way. And another thing I want to point out is we really want to emphasize effort over results. And going back to that not yet. I would rather you try and fail than not try at all, right? So seed number 3. As parents, we play a significant role in the development of resilience. We can create a nurturing environment and offer the opportunity to discuss all emotions situations. And lastly, and we'll talk about this, I'll give you a concrete example of how we can do this. We want to ensure quality time occurs regularly. This is something that is going to change, especially as kids get older and they have so many things on their plate, like competitive dance or sports. But quality time is so crucial, and it's something that we often overlook in our busy lives. All right, some things to consider. I'm just looking at the time again. So some things, sorry, actually, Alina, any questions come up by any chance?
No questions.
Okay. Thank you. So let's think, I mentioned to you earlier that I was going to discuss how things might change depending on the age. And so one thing I want you to think about is all behavior makes sense within the context in which it occurs. What I mean by that is there are reasons for why our children engage in certain behaviors. When something doesn't make sense to us, we might not have the full context, okay? And that is because behaviors have a need. So I don't just do a behavior. I'm looking for something. I'm searching for something. I'm trying to communicate something through my behavior. And I'm trying to achieve an end. And so that's one of the things that we often forget, is that our children are communicating through their behavior. And where I think it becomes really challenging for parents is if you see your child repeat a behavior over and over again, and all attempts to try to punish or consequence doesn't help to change the behavior. In that instance, what I'd ask you to consider and to be mindful of is perhaps the child is communicating to you that they're incapable of handling the scenario that you're asking them to handle. So what they might be communicating through their behavior is a skill deficit. This is crucial, particularly in the school setting, right? This is when I was consulting in the school setting, this is probably one of the most recurring things, problematic behaviors that keep happening, right? And in many ways, we try to punish or we try to give consequences, and the behavior continues to occur. So in those instances, when we start to be mindful and we start to be curious about why this might be happening, we might start to identify that it might be a skill deficit. And if it is a skill deficit, we can't punish our way out of a skill deficit. We need to teach the skills that may be missing, much like we can't work on reading comprehension if the child doesn't know how to decode, perhaps, or some argument there. But you want to teach decoding before you start to go to some bigger picture ideas. And so once we identify the skill that's missing, then we go in to try to teach that, whether it's emotion regulation, whether it's communication skills like assertiveness and frustration tolerance. Like, these are just little examples. But let me use an analogy to drive this point home. Imagine that I said to you that I had $5 million that I was willing to give away to anybody. I'm curious in the chat, or if I don't know if there's a way to put raise your hand. How many people would want $5 million? If I told you, you know what, I'm ready to give $5 million, very little that you have to do, how many people would be interested?
Okay, I think we've got reactions, so like 12, 13.
People would want the $5 million.
Most people want that, yeah.
Okay, now let's say that I said to you, cool, you can have the $5 million. The only thing I want you to do, so today's Tuesday, the only thing I want you to do is to learn a language by Monday that is unrelated to any language that you know. So for example, let's say someone said to me, I have to learn Japanese by Monday, and I have to be able to read, write, and speak Japanese by Monday, do you think I'll be able to get that $5 million? What do you think? What are the reactions? Do you think I'll be able to be fluent in Japanese by Monday if I only speak Spanish and English?
We have the open-faced surprised eye emoji popping up and some
Ah.
laughing faces.
Okay, so let's say come Monday, I come and I show up and they test me on Japanese and I can't do it. Someone might say, you obviously didn't want it enough. You weren't motivated, huh? You weren't serious about this, were you? Now, imagine that they add a punishment to that. Imagine they say to me, not only did you not get the $5 million, you're going to get fined $1,000. Now I'm paying them $1,000 for not being able to learn Japanese by Monday. Now, let's say they say to me, you know what? We're going to give you a second chance. Now we're going to give you another week, and the following Monday, you have to learn Russian. Do you think I'm going to be able to learn Russian in another week? Now, remember, I was punished. I had to pay $1,000. And again, the reality is that when I get there, I won't be able to have mastered Russian in the time allotted to me. And so this is really crucial when we're seeing misbehavior in the children that we are our children or in the school setting. Are we trying to punish away a skill deficit? Are we asking them to learn a language in a week? So just something to think about. Seed number 4. When we start to think about why our child is behaving a certain way, it can help to understand how we should respond. In some ways, what I'm suggesting is, how do we become more mindful about the things that our children are engaging in? And mindful, and when we talk about mindfulness, basically we're talking about being present, available, and non-judgmental. Non-judgmental is the hardest one, right? In some of the, at the end, I'm going to give you guys a link to some emotion focus training and resources. And emotion focus family therapy will often emphasize this idea that as parents, we all have lines in the sand that we're unwilling to cross. So I'll give you an example. I'll be very honest. Like there's a trigger that I have with my boys, for example, and and the trigger for me is if I feel that they're not that they're giving up really quickly and not trying hard is a big trigger for me. It brings up a sense of like just annoyance. And if I'm not mindful, I might allow that to change how I respond and how I behave. And so when I talk about this seed number 4, part of the process is me learning over time to say to myself, when this comes up for me, I tend to respond in this way. I tend to give this sort of, I become this dad. And really, oftentimes in that moment, I'm not the dad that I want to be. And so this is why it's really important for us, especially when our children are struggling with behaviors, for us to notice our own reactions so that we can start to make some adjustments. Some things to keep in mind in terms of thinking about developmental different ages. That's some things to keep in mind, particularly for older children. And I'm talking about grade 6 and up, although one could argue maybe a little bit earlier. When I was doing my dissertation and my PhD was on the impact of social media on females. And the idea was, the literature suggests that the more you viewed like thin images, the worse females felt about their bodies. And this concept relies on something called social comparison. Social comparison is the idea that there are times when we will compare ourselves to others across a characteristic that we crave or want. It can be, anyways, so something that we want, we will, if there is no real value, we'll compare our worth by looking at how we compare to others around us, right? So does my neighbor have a bigger house? Does my neighbor have a better car? Does my neighbor have a better job? For kids, it might be so-and-so has better shoes. They have more friends on social media. They have whatever it is, okay? And the reason I say this to you is as kids get older, the influence of families starts to decrease, and what increases is the influence of peers. So peers become much more important as kids get into the teenage years. Now, when I was doing my research, it was about high school, but I would argue that this is happening at an earlier stage now, particularly with how much our kids are on social media. And so one thing to consider if we're thinking about how our child is developing and whether they're becoming resilient, is to think about how they use media and what they're consuming. Because for the most part, kids are usually looking at influencers who are flying on private planes, who have all the best sort of gear, jewelry, clothing. We might be looking at altered pictures, so the bodies are different, they're not natural. And so that impact on the young person's brain is going to be significant when they're constantly comparing themselves to people that have more of what they want. And the literature will tell you that the more we do that, the worse we feel about ourselves. So you see an increase in depression, an increase in anxiety, an increase in wanting to obtain things that are, sort of objects like money and belongings, like electronics, for example. And so one of the things I would just want to say here is what that means is, as parents, we need to increase supervision. And if possible, reduce access. If we're noticing that it's becoming a problem, we need to step in and help our children. And the reality is this: we're all motivated and influenced by technology, right? And so if we notice it in our children, remember that they probably will not be able to break away from that influence unless you step in. So putting limits as to when they can access technology, having consequences for not following the rules. We might want to think about how do we give them a sense of meaning outside of social media. So things like community, art, sports. And if you remember before, I said to you, when they express something difficult, sitting there and allowing for that difficult sort of emotion or experience to be present is also going to instill a sense of sharing and open communication with your children. And so if you can instill a sense of open communication, you're teaching things like assertiveness so they can say no to people online, and you're guiding their decision-making process, you're instilling resilience for these kids as they navigate social media. Few things that are really important just for the schools or for parents. We want to promote media literacy, encourage critical thinking when they're engaging with media. Excuse me. And we want to also work on independent skills. And this will vary by different ages. So for younger kids, we have to put the limits as to when they're accessing technology, how long they can access it. For older kids, we want to start instilling a sense of self-monitoring. Have I been on this for too long? What should I be accessing? What can't I access? And lastly, we want to promote a sense of collaboration. So it's not about policing necessarily. It's about building a relationship where you can have those conversations with your children. Seed number 5, parents should be involved in actively regulating access to media. At the end, I'm going to give you a link to Media Smarts, which is a great website that talks about strategies on how to do that. And just remember that, again, we can all be manipulated by media and technology. So it's important for us to be mindful of that so that we can then think about how it might be impacting our kids. All right, so we're almost done. I love this picture because it reminds me of my dad and me. I feel like that's like a representation. So final thoughts. One thing I want to leave you with. If I started the conversation talking about 1 degree change, right? Thinking about small concrete things we can engage in on a regular basis that lead to meaningful changes down the road. And so I want to remind you, parenting is a process, okay? There's going to be a lot of failure as a parent. I can tell you from experience, there are many moments where I wish I could go back and do it differently. There are many moments where I struggle as a parent. And so one of the things I want to promote is self-compassion for the struggles and the difficulty that come with being a parent. If we can increase our ability to be mindful, even by 1 degree, by 1%, it will improve our ability to make better decisions and to change our behavioral outcomes. And here, if you recall earlier, I talked about quality time. So I'm going to give you an example of one small thing that you can do. I'll use myself as an example. And I've used this in other presentations. So if you've seen any of my presentations, you've heard this before. But let's say, for example, as a dad, I start to notice and feel that I'm disconnected from my boys. And I've been working long hours and they haven't seen me for a long time. And I'm feeling that. I feel like I'm disconnected. I might think to myself, what is one small thing I can do that's going to create meaning? And so let's say starting on Monday of next week, I say, you know what, when I get home from the office, I'm going to walk in through my door. I'm going to put my cell phone away and on the kitchen island far away. And I might call my youngest son, Oscar. And I might say, hey, Oscar, come over here, buddy. And he comes over and I might spend a minute or a minute and a half with him. And in that moment, I might say to him, hey, buddy, tell me about your day. What happened? And I might listen to him and I might ask him more questions. In that or a minute and a half, nothing else exists except me and him. Okay. Now you take that minute and a half, and I do it on a Monday. I then repeat it on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, a Thursday, and a Friday. I go 1 week. I repeat it a second week. I repeat it a third week. I repeat it a fourth week. What I have done is I've taken 1 or 1.5 minutes that is pretty nice the one time it happened, but when I repeat it, I've created meaning. So years down the road, when my son gets asked, hey, tell us about your dad, he might say, you know, he used to do this funny thing where he would ask me every day and we would connect. So I leave you with that, because I think that idea of one small thing that we can repeat can be something that we can use both as parents. If there's educators in the room, how do we instill a different sense of philosophy in the classroom? It can start with one small change that we repeat, and over time it becomes meaningful in a routine. So I'm basically at the end, but just want to give you some resources here, and I can share this with Mr. Howe, and then he might be able to share with the other principals that might, other schools that are here. So the first book on the left is the book by Ellie Leibowitz. It's available through the public library. It's Breaking Free of Childhood Anxiety and OCD. It will walk you through the SPACE program. Okay, The Whole Brain Child is by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. I'm huge fans of theirs. They often will talk about mindful parenting and making decisions based on sort of the need that your child is communicating through behavior. And then Ross Green is known for his collaborative partnership with your child, and this idea of problematic behaviors being related to skill deficits, and noticing that as parents so that we can start to make meaningful changes by teaching the skills that may be missing. Again, I'm going to share this so you guys can have this. You don't have to copy it so quickly or anything, but media resources, again, Media Smarts is a great website. There's also emotion focused skills training and mental health foundations. The mental health foundations here, they have free webinars that will teach you how to we'll go over like emotion coaching. So how you handle big emotions as parents, and how do we help our child to navigate and to ride the wave of emotions. And then there's a free parenting program. Alan Kasdan is another big name in parenting, and he's actually, I just found this out recently. He has a whole free parenting program that's available on his website. So that's there. Maybe I'll stay on this slide for a little bit. Just maybe if you can write down some of the names. Alan Kasdan, Mental Health Foundations. Again, I'm going to share this anyways. And then lastly, I love giving presentations. So if you have any if you want me to be involved or come do a presentation at a school, or you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We are located on Dundas Street here in Etobicoke. Here's my emails. There's Dr. E. Roldan at Etobicoke Psych, info at Etobicoke Psych if you want to ask questions. And then on social media, talking about social media, that's my Instagram handle. I guess at this point, Alina, I guess I would just ask if there are any questions. If people have questions or comments, maybe they can put it into the chat, and then I can try to address anything that comes up.
So there's just a few comments so far, but feel free to add some more. So there's just a comment here. I'm assuming this is a teacher. So students often compare themselves a lot. There's a lot of competitiveness, jealousy around academics, phys at recess. Also that students often respond to adults yelling by feeling less inclined to cooperate. And the majority of anxiety, attention, or behavior challenges are often rooted in worries.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So let's a couple of things. There's some literature findings that support the idea of cooperative activities in the classroom versus competitive activities in the classroom. And so one thing that we can do, a couple of things. As an educator or as a parent, remember that we're not going to solve everything. Okay. And so again, small incremental change. So for me, if I'm an educator, and my wife's a teacher, my brother's a teacher, so we talk about this all the time, is what can I do in my classroom to perhaps change the temperature or the feeling in that classroom by 1 degree? And the research would suggest that engaging in more cooperative activities, so doing things as a group, as a unit, is actually going to lead to decrease in aggression and competition. And so one thing I'd ask you to think about is there are other things that we can instill in the classroom that are about working together versus against each other. Now, that is very hard to do in the yard, for example. I know, for example, again, my son is very competitive soccer, and the teacher tells me that they get quite heated. So that's much harder to do when it's under our control and we have a say. I would say promote things like cooperative activities is going to lead to some changes there. Alina, some of the other sort of questions, I'm sorry, I might have missed something there.
So one of the comments was just about when adults are yelling, that students feel less inclined to cooperate.
Well, I think I would say to you that, and I do this. We do, Alina, you and I, maybe you and I haven't done it, but we've done talks with schools and teachers as well when we do some emotion coaching with teachers. But this is true of also with parents. Is that remember that that whenever we engage in verbal, like back and forth with our children, what we're doing is we're offering an opportunity for negotiation or for talking back. Again, in many ways, what we're trying to do is we're trying to communicate and reflect back to the child what they might be feeling. And us as adults are the ones that can choose to disengage, right? And so if you find that you are, and we have whole talks on parental and teacher burnout. But if you find that you're yelling all the time, or you're getting really frustrated, I think it's really crucial for you to take certain steps to try to alleviate some of those things. And I know that's not easy in today's world, in today's system, with cuts and all those type of things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is 1 degree change there would be, what is it that I constantly, find myself falling into, and how do I disengage from that? And so if I'm finding that as I yell, kids are disengaging, it's probably because it becomes adversarial. Right? And so it's no longer, and kids are digging their heels and saying, no, I get to decide. And so one of the things that I'd ask you to think about is, what can I do to tweak sort of how I communicate with children? And then when I notice that I'm falling down that path of arguing, I might sort of find ways to disengage there. Okay. I know that's not going to solve your answer, but again, invite me to your school and we can have a whole longer conversation about that. Any other questions there, Alina?
Yeah, so that ties nicely into the next question. So in recent interviews, so maybe parent-teacher interviews, parents indicated they are struggling with how to manage the behaviors and needs of their children and feel as though they don't know what to do. As an educator, how do you direct or guide them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in some ways I would ask you to consider, and if I'm talking to an educator or parents, I'm asking you to consider, is it clinically significant? Right? If it's clinically significant, meaning for me, clinically significant means it's causing impairment in the family's functioning, meaning that there's huge fights, there's huge meltdowns, it's disrupting the ability for parents to go to work, for the family to engage in dinner appropriately, or go to functions as a family, then I'm thinking we need to pull in some professional assistance. And that can include everything from community agencies like George Hull or Etobicoke Children's Center to private practices. And I am more than happy. I mean this is, if you reach out to me, I will give you a list of people in the city that I would recommend, because there are amazing clinics all over the place that have specific specialties. And so in some ways, the first question is, it might be clinically significant. If it's clinically significant, I would ask the families to consider getting professionals involved. Also, schools, and Alina, you might be able to answer here a little bit. Schools, in theory, should have resources available to them as well. I don't know what this current scenario is, but most schools will have a social worker or a psychology member assigned to them. So that might be an option, possibly as well. And then some of the resources that I'm giving you there is also would be very helpful. Any
Okay,
other?
and so then there's another question about letting our children try to problem solve. When I suggest to my daughter that she try to figure it out herself, she often gets angry. Should we just continue to be empathetic but encourage?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, anger is interesting. And I wonder if anger, and this is, you know, I think about my son in when he gets angry, and I often, what I've realized is when he is angry, it's mostly related to shame. And it's basically related to like, don't look at me. I don't want to be the person that needs help. And so I might suggest, depending on the age of your child, I might suggest that you do something, you know, collaboratively. So maybe starting part of the problem solving process, and then slowly providing some scaffolding where you're part of the process, and over time you start to decrease that process. And so it might be like, okay, let's problem solve together. Let's sit down and let's make a list of all the potential the options that we have, and let's evaluate them. And you might be playing a role. Remember, you know, sometimes families will say to me like, we don't have the time to do that, and I get it. We have a very busy household. What I would say is, if you notice how much time you end up you spend trying to clean up concerns or issues, you'll notice that this will actually save you time over, or, you know, if we extend it over years. Because what you're doing is you're instilling a sense of skills that might be quite sort of onerous on you right now, but over time you're starting to step back, and you've instilled some skills in your children to be able to do it more, you know, more likely to do it independently as they get older. Any other?
No questions at the moment. If there's any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Okay, well, I guess I just want to say, you know, I will be sharing a link to the video. It has been recorded. What has to happen is I have to clean it up of all names that come up. And then I'll share a copy of the presentation. If you do go, I do also have a YouTube channel that has previous webinars that are readily available, and today's talk is a mishmash of other presentations I've done in the past. But I will share the webinar if anyone wants to see it again later. And again, like I said, I'm quite open to any feedback, any questions, any you know, requests for any future talks. I really do enjoy doing these talks. And if there are no other questions, Alina, no questions?
No, lots of thanks. Appreciate the insight, lots of good information. Yeah, lots of positive feedback for you.
Perfect. I just wanted to just finish by saying thank you so much for, again, coming on today. I really do appreciate it, and I look forward to being in touch in the future. So have a good evening, everyone. And thank you to Alina and Mr. Howe for helping me set this up, and Alina for helping me monitor the chat. So thank you so much, everyone.